Welcome back to SideQuest episode 51, Zelda Majora's Mask episode 5. Back with me, my esteemed colleagues, Mr. Wesley Schantz, and just back on board, Mr. Ben Kozlowski from quite late on the East Coast. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Hey, it's good to be back. There it is.
Yep, we're going to start with it this time instead of ending with it, I suppose.
Excellent.
We have the gongs. And so this time around, we thought that we would talk about Snowhead Temple, which I finally had the ability and time to defeat along with their goat-like super demon boss named Goat. Got to get the powder keg, got to go through Goron Race, got to see the snow melt around Snowhead Temple, as well as in the Mountain Village, as well as Goron Village. Got to see Epona and learn her song, and I think you all defeated some ghost/aliens, whereas I did not defeat them and unfortunately saw Romani get abducted by them, sadly.
Oh!
But for next time, we'll have to work on that. Again, just so many thoughts about repetition and repeating and how this... So something we talked about last time was, in what ways is this world of Majora's Mask a dark reflection / potentially an underworld? And Ben had said that he leans more towards the dark reflection than the underworld. I would say that I do see the element of repetition, though, as also having a classical correlate in Sisyphus, as well as in popular correlates in movies like, I'm going to forget the name of the Tom Cruise one where he learns over and over again through the same day. That was a science fiction movie. But
After Tomorrow.
After Tomorrow, which has the same conceit essentially as Groundhog Day. And that there's a similar element of repetition both in Dante's Purgatorio as well as Inferno, though it's all for naught and without hope in the Inferno. And so just it's like something I keep bringing up every time we play, besides dang, this game is hard, is that it does take repetition to get through it. And something we had talked about with Majora's Mask is it gets flack for only having 4 dungeons. And I said, well, I kind of feel like it's technically in the other direction, more than 4 dungeons, because at least for me, I'll probably have to do each dungeon twice and have it be 8 dungeons. And so I guess the first thing, even though we had said in the pre-show earlier that we wanted to talk about a few things, and I would like to get to them, like the lack of romance in this so far, is that this element of repetition seems to be playing and figuring very big in this game, and especially in this part where you defeat goats, and then you can get the powder keg, and then you can race in the Goron race. But then if it's too late, you can't get this new great sword with the gold dust that makes it sharp eternally. And then you have to go back and defeat goats. And even in some of the guides I was looking at, particularly Sankey, it just sort of assumes that you're going to have to do this, and you're going to have to fight this battle again. And so I guess I wanted to ask you all about the theme of repetition and why it plays out so strongly here, and if you saw it as playing out strongly here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an awesome intro, I think, to what for me is one of the most strange and fun things about this game, I guess. There's that replayability of it, like built into the game. In most games, you play it through once and then you play it again if you want to try it again or see something new or whatever. But this game actually sort of forces you to redo things over and over again and get good at them and notice new things as you go along. And maybe sometimes it's a little frustrating, like in the case of doing a dungeon again, right? But in other cases, it's there's something kind of delightful about it. There's all the different mini games that you can sort of find scattered throughout Clocktown and the different parts of the world there in Termina. But there's also things that you don't have to do again, right? Like you mentioned the gold sword. And that I find really interesting too, that when you find certain items, you don't have to do them again. They stick with you. They become part of your character, right? Your ability to blow things up with big bombs, right? Once you master that, then you can do that anytime. And the weirdest one maybe is the banker. The guy who's a beggar in the other game is a banker this time, and he always recognizes you somehow, magically, right? It's a very strange component of the game. I'm curious to hear, Ben, what you think about all that.
I have a lot of thoughts on the subject of repetition. First, like, the most obvious thing to me as far as like how the repetition works into the way that the game itself functions and the way that sort of you interact with it is the schedule. The fact that like every character in the game has their own schedule, their own itinerary, their own set of things to do, and you have to repeat the game in order to familiarize yourself with it because they're acting in time. Like it's this very unique element to Majora's Mask. Like I've seen it in several other games, and in fact, I just played one called Outer Wilds, which uses the same element of repetition to incredible effect. But sort of like down to the minute, you can track like where will Anju be at any given moment, where will the postman be on his track. Like even though he tells you, I can't stop to talk, or else I'll be off my schedule. That level of clockwork precision is incredibly important because it means that you can interrupt your dungeon and be like, wait, no, I have to be here at 12:30 to meet Anju in order to get the cafe quest going, or I have to be at this point in order to try and get the sun mask. Like the only way to figure that stuff out is to play through it and see how your decisions affect the world, like how people react to you messing with that predetermined schedule. Like I was just playing through the first couple days as the Deku Scrub, as I'm sort of like trying to catch up with you guys. And I noticed that if you don't talk to Anju I think it's the second day when it's raining, she takes her umbrella and she walks down to the laundry pool and she just sits there waiting for Cafe, like trying to figure out what she's going to do. And this is assuming that you don't talk to her, that you don't sort of set up the meeting between the two of them, if you don't sort of put things into motion. Left to her own devices, she's sitting just that far away from him. You can even ring the bell, he'll come out, look, and then immediately run back in again, and she doesn't recognize him because he's small. But in order to know all of that information, you have to play it through multiple times. It's the only way to get that. Like you have to play through, you have to see the bomber's notebook and the little schedule blocks that it sets for each character, and you have to know, what tricks and what time-saving devices you can use to get that sort of information. Which I think is a really interesting game device, more than just even like a thematic device. Like as interesting as it is to sort of watch you and your experience mature as you play through this timeline and sort of interact with the characters, I was also kind of struck to think, like at the same time as Majora's Mask was sort of being developed and came out, there was another series of games that definitely used the same structure, if not the same mechanic, namely the Hitman series, which I know is kind of a weird one. But
Bullet
the whole...
Time.
Have you played it?
Bullet Time, right?
Not even that so much. The Hitman games were very much designed to be these little levels, like fairly manageable, although they get bigger over time. But you were supposed to repeat them. You were supposed to fail over and over and have to go back to the level and have to learn all the tips and tricks in order to navigate through it. So like the very first level in the very first game is they drop you off at a street corner and your job is to assassinate this one person. And you've got multiple ways to do it, but the key is every time you start the level, it's always in the same state, and the people will always come from the same directions, and they'll always stand in the same spot. So, you can choose which is the best sniper perch, which is the best approach to getting your target. And to this day, the gameplay loop is the same. Like, we're on the second generation of Hitman games, and they're way classier and flashier than they were, 10, 20 years ago. But it's still the same mechanic, this big sprawling world with a lot of moving pieces and a lot of people on a very fixed schedule, so you can be in the right place at the right time and affect things to make, all of the sort of like triggered responses occur so you can get your targets. Again, it's a very different use, but the repetition is still the key. Knowing the world is still the primary way that you interact with these characters and get things done.
It's interesting because it's almost like it is a cyclical or sort of Meno or Plato's Meno sort of recovery of that which has been lost sort of theory of education. I'm seeing a lot of cyclical of like an idea of metempsychosis, a Pythagorean idea, a Virgilian Aeneid Book 6 sort of circular way of going through things idea, that it's almost as if what's being said here, as we go through multiple days and go through the game multiple times and go back through the timeline. And again, it's like Camus too. He has in The Stranger, his character who's committed murder, think about the fact that if you've lived through one day, you have enough to think about for all eternity. I think that's part of what's being said by the 3 days that we find ourselves in, and just how different they look, say, to you, Ben, who's playing through this with some expertise, and me, who am playing through it as a neophyte, a first-timer. And I just don't have those repetitions that you have. And I think also that's probably something that adds to Wes's pleasure. Like some of the things that I'm finding very difficult, especially as an adult now, are like sort of pleasant things to return to, which is probably, you know, a lot of how I felt during Final Fantasy VII. But it's almost like there's even a notion of education for individuals nowadays, that like all of society and all of what culture is seems to be the accruing of this information about how things work, sort of like a clock, sort of like a medieval idea of a great chain of being. And that what is done every generation is that like all the mechanics that we figured out are laid back out for someone, and then something new is added as well. And I wonder if either of you two see something like that going on in here too, because I mean, everything takes repetition in this game so often, and there seems to be some idea that that is part of learning, but that also part of learning is restoring to you something that you have once lost, which we actually literally are attempting to do through getting Epona back, learning these songs that we once knew, getting Majora's Mask, and even earning our status as a hero.
Yeah, one of the things that I notice is repeating events in the game, and especially the dungeons. It frequently makes it more efficient. Like after you've played through any one of the dungeons, if you come back in another 3-day cycle and try and go back into the dungeon, like the front pad will glow, and it will offer you this opportunity to get teleported directly to the boss because you already have their remains. And I find that that's such an interesting complement to the repetition. Like repetition as a rule, again, like to take the myth of Sisyphus as an example, we tend to abhor repetition. We don't want to do the dishes every night. We don't want to perform the same tasks over and over again. But by performing the tasks over and over again, you find shortcuts. You learn, don't put down the spoon, just go directly from wash to dry to cupboard. Like that's the most efficient, the fastest way to do it. And so much, again, is sort of pointing to like life and life experience at large. We repeat things so we find better ways to use our time, so we don't have to spend so much time working at these dungeons, working at menial tasks. We want to find the shortcuts. We want to go cut our way through. And I mean, even if we look as far back in gaming history as like the original Super Mario, like you've got to play level 1-1 every time that you start the game, no matter how many times you play it. But the more you repeat it, the more times that you play through the game, the more you will find the tricks, the more that you'll find the shortcuts. You'll learn how to skip levels. You'll find where the extra lives are. You'll learn how to bypass so much of what was tedious before.
Right, yeah. And again, I think because of the way that the game is laid out for you each time the same way, and there's games that don't do that, of course, right? Like I think of Spelunky as a recent example, right? It sort of randomizes, and there's all sorts of random elements to keep things interesting, and even within like a scheme of repetition, like you talk about, there's certain shortcuts. There's being able to fly with the Song of Soaring to get from place to place quickly once you've been there once and struck the owl statue with your sword. And I think about this too in terms of the again, those items that you pick up that stick with you. There's the difference between the sword that you've upgraded once and the sword that you've upgraded with the gold dust that you win at the rolling competition, right? I think there's definitely some kind of metaphor there, right, for two kinds of learning, so to speak. The kind that you have like procedurally maybe done a thing a few times and sort of like it sort of works, but maybe it'll wear off, you'll forget it, versus
Right.
that learning which is fixed. You've recollected it, you've got it, and that's, I guess, the gold sword, right? Like you understand, the way to whatever the city was that they were trying to get to in the Mino. I should probably reread that, but yeah, I think that there's something there for sure.
And so, yeah, I wanted to ask you more about that, Wes. What is it that you think? So in the Theaetetus by Plato, and I'm not to just overuse his metaphors on learning, but he says that learning is like imprinting into wax. That sometimes you sort of imprint just a little bit, and it's sort of general and vague and easily disappears. And then sometimes you really deeply imprint something and really get the form of it. And it seems like you're saying that something about this game, it's almost like there are checkpoints in this game, as there were in like those old arcade racing games, whether they be like the Wave Master games or like one of the racing indie games, that there are certain things that you do not have to relearn. This seems to connect with what you're saying, Ben, that then you seem to be giving a pretty good treatise on why repetition is necessary to learning, because it leads to those soaring jumps. It leads to learning learning what is unnecessary and what is necessary. What is the most efficient path towards doing something? And that also speaks I would say speaks to me as a teacher, not only as somebody who requires people to do this, but even in my practice as a teacher, my ability to teach, say, essay writing, like with only thinking in a rationalist way about how to implement or execute the teaching of an essay, I would not get access to the same sort of information as I would empirically from actually issuing instructions and seeing what real world problems come up. In fact, this connects very much to a thought I've been having about Shakespeare, that I think he becomes such a master of language because of how much practice he gets actually having to execute writing plays. And that it's like both you and Wes are saying something like, through repetition, something much deeper than repetition starts to set in. Something like an ability through seeing massive amounts of patterns to see bigger patterns, which enable you to cover more ground, literally speaking, that enables you to move faster within the world.
Yeah, especially with all of the Zelda games, there are those very obvious checkpoints, as you said, those milestones. Like every time you get a new item that persists in your inventory in Majora's Mask, be it, the hook shot or the bow or having the song, the Epona's song, this allows you to interact with the world in a permanent way. Like having the horse means that you can traverse the ground literally faster than you could just walking. Having the hook shot means that you can skip whole sections of the Gerudo Fortress. All of these tools could very well represent like specific leaps in knowledge. And even more than just like the individual knowledge, but think of how science has worked in leaps and bounds. How you have the Copernican revolution and suddenly a whole new vista to you. You get the laws of gravitation from Isaac Newton, and all of a sudden there's like an explosion of learning surrounding this information. It doesn't happen gradually. And maybe it's just me reading Foucault lately that's informing my event-driven history, but you get this sense that once you have that aha moment, that epiphany, once you get the formula, or once you get the sort of key information, now you don't have to do all of the steps that led you up to that point. Once you know how to multiply, addition becomes less important. You don't have to add all those numbers over and over and over again. You can just do the multiplication and call it a day. And Zelda has always managed to capture that with the way that the items have consistently worked since Ocarina of Time and even since Link to the Past.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. I mean, and I guess in terms of knowledge that is crystallized and that can be passed on, versus knowledge that allows you to do something new, like a practice or an activity or whatever. I mean, I don't think that there's really necessarily an opposition there. I do think they seem to really kind of work together, and maybe there's something to like the danger of that in the form of Majora's Mask, right? It's like there's this crystallized thing which once you put it on, you can't take it off, or it's very difficult to get it off again, and it makes you do certain things just by nature of the way that you see the world now, right? Through these slits, the mask possesses you, and I certainly think certain kinds of learning and ideas are just that dangerous, right? They make you into a much worse person, right? And then it's sort of a matter of falling back on other maybe procedures and sorts of knowledge, and going through certain processes and games, if you like, right? Rituals to try to undo some of that damage, right? Connect back with the giants that uphold the world, right? To save the day. There's definitely a danger to certain kinds of knowledge, and much worse than just like the frustrating having to do the dungeon again.
Yeah, I noticed too, I mean, as I've been playing through, I've noticed more and more this theme of maturity running through the game. Like, I know that when you were reading what I wrote earlier, you mentioned sort of the discussion about alienation and how, like, as a Deku scrub, everybody looks down on you. And while some of that I think is just the fact that he's a Deku scrub, more often than not, when you talk to people in Clocktown on those first 3 days, they talk about you as a kid. Like, that's why they won't let you leave. Even on the third day, when like everybody's deserted Clocktown, if you talk to one of the guards as a Deku scrub, he would be like, "Look, I want you to leave as much as anyone else, but your parents are probably looking for you. I can't let you leave until they find you, or then something worse will happen. Like, the disconnect will be an even worse situation." And again, so often when Link, as a human, as a Deku scrub, as anyone, interacts with one of the other characters, it's usually in terms of that maturity. So, like, there was even a moment I was playing through the swamp area and met the one witch in the forest who's been injured. She got knocked off her broom by the Skull Kid, and she needs a potion. If you go to her without the potion, which you have to the first time around, you don't have the bottle at that point. She says, "Well, what good are you anyway? Like, you're not all that you're cracked up to be. Here we thought you were the hero, and you show up empty-handed. Come on." So again, you need the knowledge to get there, and it's that maturity that she expects. Like, by carrying the sword, the guards let you leave, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're fully equipped to be the hero at this point. It takes time. It takes work.
Right, and some things have to be redone and repeated over and over again. And something interesting about this is that I think a soft way to interpret this would be sort of like in sort of a baptismal way, or in that Virgilian underworld way, that like, well, you always get a second chance, you get another chance. But I don't think the game actually comes over to that point quite like that. I think the game is actually fairly firm about, even though there is a cyclical nature to the time here, that there being a sense of progression, and that there is a certain level of progression after which certain things are lost, like the Deku Butler's son, for example. Like, there is still lost time. There are still things lost within the world, like potentially even the chance for we'll see, whether there's redemption for Majora's Mask or the person wearing it right now, the imp. But I mean, I just think as sort of a comic example of this is sort of Tingle, right? I think we started touching on him last time. But I think there's something really negative and gross and interesting in him, and that he seems to be sort of like what you were from the Ocarina of Time, like a man who thinks he's an elf, but he seems to be sort of like the negative, like, I don't know, video game player who refuses to grow up or something. And, maybe I'm wrong about him, but he's literally at middle age, 35, and has not received his fairy yet. So it's like he has failed to grow up, and he's lost his chance. or is what I'm seeing there. That this game is saying that there are, and who knows what's going to happen in Tingle's life, and maybe he's perfectly successful selling maps. But it does seem as if the game is not saying that you do have infinite chances to make everything right all the time.
Yeah, I think too. There's a suggestion there that the role is wrong with Tingle. Like, if you talk to Tingle, he says, "Well, I'm 35, but my fairy hasn't come to me yet, but I haven't given up hope." But then, if you talk to the guy at the swamp tours, like the big guy over at the side who checks your PictoBox pictures, he has a relationship with Tingle. I suspect that he's his father. And like initially when you talk to him, he's actually grumbling about Tingle, about how it's immature for him to be going around looking for fairies at his age. But what's worse, if you take a picture of Tingle with the PictoBox and submit that as your picture, he gets very uncomfortable. And he ultimately just like gives you a piece of heart to get rid of you. It's this really bizarre little side quest. So on the one hand, Tingle is meant to be sort of like, again, that sort of dark reflection of who Link is, the person who lost his fairy and is now sort of palling around with this fairy in the meantime, someone who had one and now it is not there, even though, whether Link is supposed to have a fairy or not is a whole question for Ocarina of Time. But on the other hand, like Tingle's not supposed to have a fairy. He wasn't a Kokiri. He wasn't a forest child. Termina isn't anywhere near Kokiri Forest. So, the same rules do not apply. The couple of fairies who you do run into seem to be unattached to humans unless, they decide to pal around with them like Tattle and Tail do with the Skull Kid. But they're not required. It's not a rite of passage as it was in Kokiri Forest at the beginning of Ocarina of Time. So Tingle's very out of place there. His search is wrong-headed. He is not meant to have a fairy. He is not meant to participate in the hero's quest in that sense. He's a map maker. And I think everybody sort of knows this. Like, Tingle himself is sort of kidding himself into thinking that he can still be a kid, still play that role. And I think that does line up with this sort of negative view of the gamer as being stunted, as being unwilling to grow up. Like Majora's Mask is a tough game. There's a lot of darkness in it, one way or the other. And I think that issue of maturity is very much at the heart of it. But, just as a lot of the characters have to make these very difficult decisions in order to mature, Tingle is one of those who hasn't been able to make that decision and is thus stuck.
Yes, arrested, held aloft by his red balloon, literally like disconnected, right? And that makes him such a great map maker, though, right? Like he knows these places like no one else. He gives you these maps which have like magical properties. You can see everything that's there that you can actually go to. So there's something, he has like a kind of savant, skill in that way. It's not very practical in some sense. Like it's not very healthy for him, certainly. But it's great for you as a person who does go around and gets to do heroic things within this world that he has so accurately sketched for you. I remember that you can take a picture of him and show it to the guy in the swamp. I also, I think to this maturity question, the whole idea of taking pictures, I know in the Gerudo fortress, right? One of the things you have to do is get a picture of one of the Gerudo, right?
Yes.
The who are like these sort of Princess Jasmine looking characters, right? And take it to the fisherman. He really wants to see a picture of them. And the same thing happens in the Zora fountain place. You got to take a picture of the singer and show it to somebody there. I think he's like a big fan of hers. And so there's something creepy about kind of this question of maturity as it relates to romance or sexuality in the game. Obviously, that's not like an issue for Link himself so much in this particular game, but it's there in strange kind of manifestations. Oh,
It's a halfway mark.
All right, and so yeah, so that theme of not yet being matured rather than having missed the opportunity to mature, and so something I was talking about in the pre-show, being interested to hear your comments on, were the lack of sort of romantic interest of Link in this game that are so conspicuous in Ocarina of Time. For instance, even in Kokiri Forest, he has that young, I think, blue-haired Kokiri that he talks to. He then has a Sora princess who's pretty interested in him. I think there's even a Gerudo girl who's fairly explicit with him.
Niburu is not subtle.
Yeah, by no means subtle. And so, you know, and of course Princess Zelda, and it's, you know, who herself plays a sort of Rosalind figure as also the Sheik or the Sikh. And so, you know, it's very much, there's an idea of romance being a part of growing up there, just as it's very much integral to the Harry Potter series. But what do you make of the fact that it seems to be in the background or is in some way perverted or perverse in this world, or at least how we've been conveying it in its sort of vicarious elements so far? Also through, of course, a lens.
I think the two sort of missing elements here, like there's definitely an element of voyeurism, especially as it relates to the Picto Box and sort of this Arrested Development, dealing with Tingle and some of the sort of immature sexuality of some of the other characters. But on the one hand, we also see a couple of romances that do work, specifically Kafei and Anju. And that one is really sort of convoluted in its relationship to maturity, because on the one hand, like they're both grown people, but then Kafei is turned young and Andrew seems to accept him anyway. Like it's not entirely clear what the thesis is there, except that relationship does seem perfectly healthy. If anything, the concern is about appearances only, and that's not a good reason to quit the romance. Like, while you have all these characters looking for pictures, trying to be voyeurs, on the other hand, you have this couple who has a very intimate relationship, a very loving one, and a very almost doomed romance. And it's like the game frames it as a good thing, without any sort of apology or hedging about the subject. But the other quest that sort of springs to mind as far as the romance is concerned is actually, like, after you do theoretically save Romani from the aliens, you have a very unique relationship with the older sister, Cremia, in a follow-up side quest. And while she does not actually strike up like an earnest romance with Link, the hero, again, it's tied to maturity. The reward you get for fighting off the Gorman brothers and protecting their milk caravan as it's shipped to Clocktown, you get the cow mask, Cremia's mask, which is a sign of maturity. Like it's the pass you need to get into the milk bar, which is sort of coded as like a 21 and older actual bar. So as soon as you start wearing that mask, everyone accepts you as an adult. And sometimes it's even explicit how that works. And Cremia will hug you if you already have the mask. So there is this sort of subtle sexuality or romance element, but it's very slight, sort of on par with your relationship with Romani, or the character Malin, back in Ocarina of Time. Like, she's not one of the romantic interests. She's one of the few characters who actually like survives the 7-year period and does not get sort of subsumed into the Temple of Light. She's one of the few characters who you can return to. But it's also very understated in that romance. Like in Ocarina of Time, the Zora princess is very forward with you, like almost aggressively so, to the point that it's just sort of silly. It doesn't make sense. And likewise, Nibiru's blatant sexual advances are just completely out of place in some ways. But with Malin, it's not that out of place. It's okay. Like you were kids together, and then you saved her farm. She would be a legitimate person to have a relationship with, to settle down with, and that follows through in her counterpart in Majora's Mask. But the other element, I think, is that Link's relationship to other characters is very different in this game as well. He's not the motive force. He's a blank slate. Like he is whatever mask he is wearing at any given moment. So it's very hard for him to be a character in that sense. You know, where everyone in Ocarina of Time said, "Hey, you're obviously the hero, so you know I relate to you in some way." Be it Zelda, you know, sort of instigating activities with that romantic undercurrent, or you know, the Zora Princess making her deliberate advances. Like they relate to him because they know he's a big deal, he's important. Whereas you're kind of just in the shadows in this game, and that's sort of your role. Half the characters you interact with don't even realize it's you. Like again, playing through the forest temple, when you approach the monkey in the cage, there's this sort of absurd interaction where if you start by interacting with him as the Deku scrub, he'll say, you know, I didn't do it, I'm not guilty, as though you're just one of his persecutors. But if you talk to him as Link, he will immediately open up to you and then ask you, do you have an instrument that will carry over long distances? And you have to transform into the Deku scrub again. At which point he says, "Oh, and who are you?" As though, you know, he doesn't recognize just the putting on of the mask is enough to completely obscure your appearance, even when you were in the exact same spot that you were talking to him before. So since Link doesn't have an identity, he can't very well have a romance. And it's only in his human form that he does, and only in those couple of situations where he has to be human to progress the story that he can actually have a relationship of that sort. So Cremia and Romani are two of the only characters that he can have that relationship with.
That just, yeah, Wes, I want to shoot. I just want to share a theory really quickly that made me think.
Go for it.
It makes me wonder whether part of what we're circling around here is, again, something about being a kid is being protean, having those shifting forms, like in his Dark Materials, how your diamond can constantly change. But then once you're an adult, it seems to take a form, a very particular form, like you become a type. And that protean element sort of disappears. What is sort of making me think here, the fact that Link is so different and identityless here. He is so protean in that you can put on the mask and he's treated in different ways. But I think that is subsumed, that is within the larger arc potentially of the fact that this game might be saying that regardless of what your age is, your maturity can change depending upon the endeavor you're engaging in. For example, if I'm playing baseball that I've played for 30 years and studied, I can achieve one heck of a level of a maturity in relation to that game. But if you then like put me performing ballet, I'm again going to have to be like a youth. Like I'm going to be like a young person again. If you put somebody into new territory, regardless of what that happens to be, whether it's now confronting death or being identityless after being, you know, a big shot or a hero in this non-reflected world or this lightly reflected world, that when you throw someone into new territory, you also affect their attitude, that they go from a mature place or a place where they can be mature due to experience into a place where they are now immature and where they're going to have to now gain and gather experience in order to become mature. It's as if this game is a reflection on how you age as well, and how you don't age in a simply linear fashion, because the world doesn't work in a simply linear or chronological fashion, right? Like you have more and less meaningful days, more and less impactful moments in your life that you then have to adapt to. And it's like this game is sort of trying to prepare you for that. And Wes.
That's awesome. I was just going to say something like kind of simple, I guess, about the cow mask. I think it's a pretty strange moment how she sort of decides that you've matured now. But it certainly makes you sort of look at that squarely, right? Like think about that really in a pretty direct way. It's like it forces you to be reflective on what the game is saying about maturity, if that is what it means to, have grown up, right? To have accompanied this, eligible young woman from her home to the big city and bringing this valuable cargo, protecting it from the thieves who would take it, right? And then sort of behind all of that, right, she tells you something extra about Andrew and Cafe, right? Maybe that's the hint that you needed to really get going in earnest on their quest. But of course, you'd have to start time again to do it. And I guess I think that with that, there's something too about the ways that the milk bar at the very end of the game becomes like a critical place, because once you have the ability to buy what they sell there, you're pretty much untouchable at that point, right? You get infinite magic from that. That's like true maturity or something like that, perhaps. The other example that I would throw out for like super maturity maybe is the old grandma, right? The grandma who tells you stories. I just think she's such a wonderful character, and her little storyline is so interesting that you have to find a way to stay awake during her stories so that you can actually hear them, and she rewards you for that. I love that part of the game.
Yeah, the Chateau Romani, the magic milk that gives you the infinite magic, like there's a lot going on with sort of its interaction and its effects on you. Like again, it sort of is sort of cutely standing in for alcohol in some sense. Like they serve it at the bar. It's the really fancy stuff. Like everybody wants it. It goes at a ridiculously high price if you sell it at the curiosity shop. Like it's good stuff. And the only way that you can get it is with a maturity mask or by completing Anju's quest. And it does make so much easier. Like if you have Chateau Romani going into the boss fight in the Stone Tower Temple, it's a breeze.
Yes.
If you have it when you have the Fierce Deity mask and fight Majora himself in like the final battle, it's a breeze. That makes things so much easier. But at the same time, like it's tied to two really interesting characters. On the one hand, you've got the circus guy, like the Gorman brother, who is apparently dissociated from his friends over at the farm. And on the relationship between the two is really weird. When you meet the initial Gorman brothers, they're kind of jerks. They're the ones who are sort of like wearing these masks to attack the caravan when you're protecting it from them. So it's like they're trying to steal the maturity rather than gain it honestly. But at the other end, the guy at the bar, who again is one of the same brothers, he's sitting there sort of bemoaning his woes. There's obviously a backstory, a past there, and one of the little quests that you do in the bar is you play your instrument. It reminds him of this song that sort of brings back this whole chain of memories. And overwhelms him emotionally. Like he remembers seeing Rudo, the Zora singer, and being profoundly moved by her. And he gives you his own mask, the circus leader's mask, which cries. Like that's the defining characteristic. You walk around with this mask on and it does nothing but cry. And if you wear it when you're defending Cremia's wagon from the Gorman brothers, they will attack you. They'll stop. The entire quest becomes just them standing at a distance, following you almost solemnly, as though they're escorting you instead of attacking. And just on the one hand, you've got these people trying to steal maturity. On the other hand, you've got this person who is almost over matured, who has experienced too much, and that itself earns respect in its own right.
Yeah, and just the idea that two of the items that you get are both white milk and gold like honey. It's just you have both the images of the celestial rose in heaven from Dante, which is described alternatively as golden and as white.
Mm-hmm.
But also just even the pagan idea of the place of milk and honey, and the idea of like a paradise where an Eden it is itself cyclical. It is a perpetual motion perfection machine, right? Like the mover at the center of the universe. It is the gift that keeps on giving, as the Neoplatonists would say. The ever giving thing that never receives. That is the overflowing pneuma, I guess.
Aseity as the divine characteristic, yeah.
Right, but like the idea is that from this sort of taking of nature, and the idea that you learn this from the old woman, right? Like you are learning the lessons literally of nature that you have to be awake to articulate it. That it enables you to have a perspective or a maturity that is the gift which then keeps on giving, right? Because then any situation you're in, you can derive true information from, and that's like true mana, and that's like so that I think I see the cyclical nature even in the images that the game uses to show sort of an equilibrated or a perfected state of a finite being.
At the same time, though, there's another side to this. Like, Chateau Romani may be sort of like nectar of the gods, operating this sort of perfected role, but it also has a sort of, like, I've been suggesting that it's an analog for alcohol this whole time, because the game kind of treats it like that. You can't get into the bar without the mask, and you can only get the Chateau Romani in the bar. But if you follow Cremia and Romani around on the third day, Romani tells you that she has, to this point, not been allowed to drink Chateau Romani, and she's not allowed to participate in the festival because she's too young. She's not grown up yet. And on the third day, she tells you that Cremia has changed her mind. And she has decided that tonight she's going to give Romani the Chateau Romani for the first time. Why? Because Romani is an adult now. It doesn't mean that she's going to the festival. She's not going to leave. She's not going to participate in like taking the milk to town the way that she wants to. All of the other signifiers of maturity are gone. But what's important is that it's the third day. Like, she's being put to sleep with Chateau Romani, so when the moon falls, she won't feel pain. And that, too, seems to be this other side of maturity. Like, the reason why the circus leader, the Gorman brother leader, is hanging out at the bar is not because he wants to remember these things, it's because he wants to forget. And the Chateau Romani allows him to do that. Like, on the one hand, it is this sort of idealized thing, this perfection. But on the other hand, it is a profound escapism. It is something you get access to because of all of the things that you've suffered, because of all the things that you could suffer. Maturity is related to that pain. And the game has a very profound respect for those who have suffered to get to that point. They're rewarded. They're rewarded with escape.
That's profound, because that recalls to me sort of the reward of Frodo as well, that he gets to escape after having done his grand, spoiler alert, after having done his grand feat of throwing the ring into Mount Doom. Simple enough task, but he gets to leave and go to the White Isles. But also that reminds me of just the dual aspects of wine as both intoxicating but also renewing in the Dionysian fashion. It renews itself, but it can also be used to intoxicate. So there's like an enlightening aspect to it, in vino veritas, but there's also an aspect of being able to delude yourself. And also that also recalled to me the idea of the river Lisi from Greek Lanthano, to forget, the river that you get in earthly paradise, the top level of purgatory. One of the rewards is you get to forget everything that happened. And so there does seem to be both a negative and a positive connection to the idea of forgetting due to the nectar of life. Is that like a baptismal reward for you? Is that just a crass escapism? What is that exactly? And then probably that's got to be the last question that we either confuse or enlighten on tonight.
I think the one particularly interesting element that ties into is the fact that for every character in this game except you, there's only 3 days, like only one set of 3 days. Whatever goes wrong, whatever mistakes you make, you are the only one who remembers them. Which, to sort of tie back to like what we're talking about here, if the reward for maturity and for suffering is to be able to forget, then that means that Link is the exception. He has to remember. He will experience all this and he will retain it, because for him, each cycle isn't a cycle. It's part of a longer line. He has to traverse this whole thing. And if anything, his job is to protect people from the pain and the suffering and the horror that is about to come upon them. He stands in as sacrifice in a very likely Christian sense, because it is 3 days after all. The sins of the world are carried on his shoulders, and they do not have to be borne by the other people in this world. And that's tough for you as Link, for sure, but it's great for everyone else.
Yeah, it's like, well, as a person playing the game too, right? Like you also get to forget maybe some cares that you have in your real life for the time that you're playing, and well, maybe that's not such a bad thing if you get some perspective on it as a result of getting a little relaxation or respite. The way that I guess we'll come back to this at the very end, right? The way that operates in terms of beating the game, I think is interesting too, though. It's like, so now what, right? Like you accomplished the thing. Well, what happens now to this hero? And I think the Christian story has that same ambiguity, or Tolkien appeals to it in that essay where he talked about escape, right? And how that's not such a bad thing. But, it's a myth among myths. It's got a special quality to it for those who believe in it. But what really sets it apart, right? That's a difficult question. And if it is a historical one in some sense, well, history has kept on going, right? And there's still plenty of terrible things happening that drive us to, play video games to escape them, right? So, and read fantasy novels and all that good stuff. So there's a really interesting, perplexing component to that, and I really like that you've drawn that out here. I think this has been a really excellent conversation, guys.
Agreed.
I agree. Yeah, Raphael and Adam have certainly taken their fill of Edenic food tonight, and I think again that's the value of this endeavor. My girlfriend was making fun of me the other day. She was like, "What eternal question has playing that video game brought up for me today?" And and I sort of was laughing to myself, and it's like, it's like a magician being off stage. It's like you can, it's like once I'm having the conversation with the guys, we'll figure it out. It's like the land is as of now just mapped, but we're not treading it together. Once we are, we'll see what's there. And again, there's this too seems to be a land of milk and honey.
Mm-hmm. And to sort of draw it back to that Socratic recollection metaphor, the only way to remind each other is to dialogue. We got to talk it through.
Right. Got to. I know a lot more now and a lot less than I did before.
Amen to that.
Amen to that. All right. So for this next time, we were thinking about I better get this horse and defeat these aliens. But do we want to go on to the Zora beachfront? Is it? What is it? Or did we want to? I know that we were kicking around the idea of doing more in town.
Well, I think we should go to the sea. Do as much of the you got to kind of explore a bit. It's sort of like each one gets a little more involved. So yeah, see what you see when you get there at the Great Bay.
Will do. Will do. I'll head on over. Okay. Well, guys, on to your next side quest.
All right. Thanks.